that people say is that the U.S. meddled too much in Ukraine and this provoked Russia. And this, to me, is just sort of naive, right? One, the U.S. is involved in Ukraine. They're involved in Europe. They're involved in different countries. You want the U.S. involved in a lot of countries. There's certain countries maybe we shouldn't have been involved, but in Europe, if we're going to be involved anywhere, Ukraine, that's a good place to be involved. To be active and helping to support democracy and liberty. It doesn't mean Ukraine's perfect. It doesn't mean it doesn't have corruption. It does. But compared to Russia, it's a more noble country. I just saw Charlie Kirk recently saying, Ukraine and Russia are both evil. Like, that's psychotic. That's ridiculous. Ukraine is good, but really imperfect. And Russia, not the people, but the government, is evil, right? Putin is evil. And what people who think that Putin and Russia were provoked into this invasion, what they don't understand is, one, the philosophy that actually drives Putin. Most of his territorial ambitions are nostalgia for a Russia that once existed, that he wants to reclaim, that he wants to rebirth. He wants Russia to be a global power, sees it as a global power, sees it as the leader of Eurasia. That's what he wants. Ukraine has a certain mythical and religious aspect to it that Putin finds very attractive. He sees it not as its own country, but an artificial entity, that it's actually part of Russia. Kyiv is the seat of Russian Orthodoxy. That means a lot to Putin. Most of his drives for Ukraine are, quite frankly, internal. I've always said about 95% of the weight of all the variables is internal. It's what Putin wants. It's not external actions regarding NATO and Ukraine. When it comes to NATO, yes, you could say that NATO provoked Putin into invading, but not for the reason people think. The idea of Ukraine joining NATO, the reason Putin didn't want them to join is not because NATO is a threat to Russia, right? NATO is defensive. He didn't want Ukraine to join NATO because he couldn't do what he's doing now, which is invade and take over Ukraine. That's why he didn't want Ukraine to join NATO. And anybody who studies Putin knows this is the case. It's just, that is the case. Okay? Sure, he doesn't want, U.S. military bases right on his border. Okay, that's also partially true. But again, we need to understand what's really driving him. If Ukraine joins NATO, he couldn't take over NATO. So it's mostly like an internal drive. And the other thing about Putin and Russia that you need to really understand is that they always were meddling in Ukraine. I see a lot of Americans, especially on the right recently, say the U.S. is always meddling in Ukraine and that provoked Russia. Ukraine's an ally. Russia was meddling in Ukraine, and a lot of our actions in Ukraine were to counter Russian meddling in elections. Counter Russian meddling in arming resistance groups in the East, right? Fomenting chaos. And a lot of useful idiots, quite frankly, have taken this Putin talking point, this Kremlin talking point, and ran with it and believe Putin and the Kremlin. And it's this weird, a lot of the America First people, and I'm conservative. I don't have Trump derangement syndrome. I like a lot of what Trump's doing. I really think a lot of MAGA supporters get a bad name. But this America First movement, it's really odd when it comes to international policy. They blame America first very often. And that's kind of weird for a conservative movement to do it. But, is the MAGA movement still conservative, or is it something new? Is it sort of revolutionary in its own sense? I think it has some revolutionary aspects, and I don't like all of that, all of the revolutionary aspects of the MAGA movement at all. I think there's real problems there. I think you have a lot of people, quite frankly, talking about international politics who have, zero idea what they're talking about. Quite frankly, I spent a lot of years studying Putin and Russia. When I started grad school, I was actually studying fascism. Now, it doesn't mean much of anything, but it does mean I've taken this stuff seriously. And I think there are a lot of people talking about Ukraine and Russia who, knew nothing about Russia 2 days before they started talking about it. Right? So it's people who haven't been to Ukraine, spoken to anybody on the ground, or, and they just kind of like regurgitate other people's talking points. They haven't really thought about it. I don't think they understand what Putin really believes. I think they take him at face value. And Putin's a sneaky SOB, right? He's sneaky. He knows how to play certain politicians, certain so-called public intellectuals, and definitely journalists. I mean, you can see one of the weirdest things I ever saw was, when he interviewed Tucker Carlson, the interview with Tucker Carlson, and Putin goes on for like an hour, giving him like a history lesson, essentially, kind of explaining why Ukraine is a valid invasion, right? And why he wants Ukraine. And Tucker just took it, it's weird. I don't think Tucker was prepared for that. When you start to understand Putin and his philosophy, right? Which is what he's always come back to. It's what the people around him talk about. It's what his favorite philosopher talks about, Alexander Dugin. You start to realize he wants Ukraine for reasons that are not apparent to a lot of people, and that he's been meddling in Ukraine, trying to get pro-Russian presidents, pro-Russian leaders elected, and doing it by any means necessary, and also arming groups that are hostile to Ukraine, and then lying about there being this neo-Nazi problem in Ukraine. Now, there are neo-Nazis in Ukraine. They're a very small portion of society, and they need to be watched, obviously. But the idea that Ukraine is overrun by neo-Nazis, he's just using that because, the Russian, one of the cultural moments in history that Russians are most proud of is when they fought the Nazis. So if he can link what he's doing now to what the Russians did, the Soviet Union did in World War II, what Russia did in World War II, that's what he's trying to do. But it's kind of a woke move, right? To say, well, Ukraine's a bunch of Nazis and punch a Nazi or invade a Nazi country. So anyways, when you start to understand Russia and Putin, you realize most of his drive is internal, and a lot of the U.S. actions in Ukraine were countering Russian and Putin's actions in Ukraine.